All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Kevin and I today on the IECC versus ASHRAE webinar. This webinar will be recorded and the recording sent out to all attendees. If there are any issues with audio, please feel free to write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello, and I'm a project manager for NORESCO. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by NORESCO. So Kevin and I have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. We're at the end of our Wednesday webinar series now. So we've got one more after this on the 12th on functional testing of lighting controls. So please join us for that one. And then in addition to that, if you have a group or your jurisdiction is looking at adopting a new energy code, or code in general, feel free to reach out. We offer a technical assistance program where we can provide subject matter expertise on amendments, policy meetings, committee meetings, all different kinds of things. So we're here as a resource. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions about that program, or if you're looking into maybe having a personalized training for your jurisdiction or company. And then lastly, there's this code adoption toolkit, which Shauna and I gave a presentation on a couple weeks back, but it's got a plethora of resources on there. We're continuously adding to it for code compliance pathways, advanced building codes, troubleshooting guide. So there's a lot of different things on there. And if you have any questions about it, again, feel free to reach out. And then, so throughout the webinar, we do want to encourage questions. Please use the Q&A function, and I'll let Kevin know at the end of the presentation. The chat window can also be used to chat among participants if you'd like. And then lastly, there is the ability to raise your hand and ask a question directly to Kevin. So I can unmute you then. And so today our presenter is Kevin Perry. Kevin is a certified commissioning professional with a decade of experience. He's certified as a plant examiner and inspector for IECC and ASHRAE. So, you know, let's dive in. We've got some new codes to jump into. I'm gonna actually be polling the audience a few times today. So just to get an idea of who's in the room, if you could go ahead and take a minute to answer that. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that poll and share the results. So it looks like, Kevin, we've got a bunch of building officials in the room and some engineers and architects, and really all the trades. So got a good balance between everyone.
Great. Well, I'll get started then. Can you see my screen okay, Erica?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So thanks for joining. Today's presentation is going to be on the similarities and differences between IECC and ASHRAE 90.1. And for this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the IECC 2021 version, which correlates with the ASHRAE 90.1 2019 version. And we're only going to be covering the commercial sections of those. So we have a lot to cover today, so we'll jump right in. The agenda for today, I'll give you a little bit of background between the two paths for IECC and ASHRAE, and then we're going to jump into the sections below that ASHRAE and IECC cover. So what is IECC? IECC stands for the International Energy Conservation Code. It is an energy code. What is ASHRAE 90.1? If you're not familiar with that, ASHRAE 90.1 is also an energy code. So you might ask yourself, why have two energy codes? Well, the majority of state commercial building energy codes are based on the IECC. And then ASHRAE 90.1 is a national energy reference standard that's used in energy legislation and organizations like GBC. IECC references ASHRAE 90.1 as an alternative pathway, compliance pathway. Because 90.1 is the reference standard, these two codes roughly match each other, but they don't quite match each other. That's why we have two of them. And as you'll see throughout the presentation, that these two codes, which were once a lot further apart, are now growing closer and closer together. So when you're choosing or picking your pathway, you have to follow either IECC or ASHRAE 90.1. You have to stay in that pathway, and you can't combine from one or the other. Now, the last little bit of background I'll give you, if you're unfamiliar with these, that both ASHRAE and IECC are on 3-year cycles. So IECC 2021 is what we're talking about. The next time that would come out would be 2024. And then we're talking about ASHRAE 90.1, 2019. The next time that would come out would be 2022. So just add the 3 years to it. I might be off on my math a little bit, but it's okay, you get the idea. So let's jump into the pathways. The IECC pathway has 3 pathways you can look at: the prescriptive pathway, total building performance pathway, or as I mentioned earlier, shooting you over to ASHRAE 90.1. If you're following the IECC pathway of prescriptive or total building performance, you have to do that plus option down below. So you also would have to do maintenance information and system commissioning. I'm more of a visual person, so if you like it visually, here's the visual way of the IECC pathway. Again, you have the prescriptive, the total building performance, or ASHRAE 90.1. So for the ASHRAE 90.1 pathway, you get to pick one of the following: prescriptive, energy cost budget method, or performance rating method, also known as Appendix G. And just like IECC, you have this plus down here at the bottom. There's some other items that you have to do, including compliance documents, labeling of the materials and equipment, inspections, verification, testing, and commissioning. So again, if you are the visual person, here is the visual way to look at the ASHRAE 90.1 pathways: prescriptive, ECBM, or Appendix G. So let's look at that all together. So you have 5 different pathways for IECC or ASHRAE 90.1 to follow. And here are your 5 options on the screen: IECC prescriptive, total building performance, or ASHRAE prescriptive, energy cost budget, or Appendix G. Now, just remember that your local jurisdiction might amend these pathways to either add to them or reduce the amount of pathways that can be pursued. But if you're following the reference guide or standards to a T, these are your 5 pathways. So we'll pause right now for a poll question. The poll question is, what pathway in your mind is the easiest to comply with? So out of those 5 pathways we just discussed, in your experience or in your opinion, which one is the easiest to comply with? Now, every year, those pathways are going to change a little bit differently. But just in your experience, you probably don't have any experience since these are so new with 2021 or 2019. So just go ahead and answer that, and then we'll see the results. All right, so looks like the most selected one is the IECC prescriptive then followed by the ASHRAE prescriptive. All right, I think we have one more poll question as well, right here. So now that you've answered that, which pathway do you think uses the least amount of energy of those 5 pathways? So not all the pathways are equal in terms of performance or efficiencies that are required for different equipment or systems. So that directly affects the energy usage on which pathway you go down. So we'll give this a few more seconds and we'll see the results. All right, and results are in. The ASHRAE energy cost budget method looks to be that the most people think that use the least amount of energy, followed by the IECC total building performance. So we had 36% versus 33%. Those are very interesting. We'll go through the presentation and we'll explain you'll see the differences in terms of where energy might be used more or efficiencies might be a little bit more restrictive in some areas versus the others. So let's jump right into the envelope section. So there are some similarities between ASHRAE 90.1 2019, sorry, I forgot the 0.1 there, and IECC 2021. And the similarities for the envelope section are our air leakage. So both ASHRAE and IECC, no matter which pathway you go down, requires something to do with air leakage testing. So you'll have to test your building for air leakage no matter which pathway you go down. There are exceptions to that, and I believe I'll go through that in the next slide. If not, then I'll jump back. So let's talk about the differences. The differences between ASHRAE and IECC is air leakage. Well, you said, well, we just had those similarities. Well, what I'm saying there is that it's going to be required no matter what to do air leakage testing. However, the difference is the passing rate or the type of testing sampling that can be done down the pathway. So it is a similarity, but it is also a difference. So the similarity is you got to do it. The difference is the method of passing. Some other differences are your insulation values and your door and window U factors. So doors and window U factors, we're using, let's jump into insulation values first, sorry. So I've created this chart. You can see the components on the left, then we have the categories of ASHRAE 90.1 2019, non-res, and then group R, and then you have IECC 2021, group R, and all other. And you can see, I try to make it easy for you that anything highlighted in yellow is different from the others. So a lot of similarities, quite a few similarities, probably more similarities than there are differences between the two pathways of ASHRAE and IECC in terms of insulation values. The next slide here continues that same chart, if you will, or graph. A few more differences here. I think the biggest difference here you would see is that the heated slabs are on grade, slabs on grade. But other than that, everything seems to be pretty closely lined up. So you can even see walls below grade in non-residential are 7.5, but they're also R7.5 in IECC. But if you look in the group R, it's R10 continuous, and same thing with IECC 2021, it's R10. So even though that's highlighted, it's the same across the board. I was just pointing out that there's a difference between residential and non-residential on there. So let's look at windows. I did the same type of chart for you here, and you'll see that there's nothing highlighted. Well, there's nothing highlighted because there's no difference in the requirements for ASHRAE 90.1, 2019 and IECC 2021. So some of these values you probably aren't as familiar with yet if your jurisdiction hasn't adopted this code cycle. So some of these values may seem a little bit more aggressive than what you're used to, but this is what's coming if you're going to be adopting that. And just know, no matter which pathway you go down, the values are still going to be the same. Okay, so let's talk about the air leakage. So remember we said that there are similarities and differences in air leakage for envelopes. So you'll still have to do the test. So I tried to create a table that's simple in my mind. Maybe it's not simple in yours, but let's go through it to make sure that you understand it. So the task on the left, you can see that we have air leakage rate. So that's telling us that you're going to have to do some type of air leakage testing. ASHRAE 90.1 2019 has it as an overall building category, where if you look on the right side of the screen, IECC 2021, it's broken out into R occupancies, R/I occupancies, sorry, and then non-R/I occupancies. And based on that, you have a different allowable leakage rate. So you can see for ASHRAE, it's 0.40 CFM per square foot of envelope. And that is exactly the same for non-R/I occupancies for IECC. The only difference there is when we go to R or I occupancies, your leakage rate, allowable leakage rate goes down. However, it's also at a different testing pressure, building pressure. And the reason for that is that it's going to allow sampling, and that gets us to the next line. So all of the pathways allow for sampling for building envelope leakage testing. ASHRAE says it has to be based on square footage. So if your building's over 50,000 square feet, you can break the building up and do testing. IECC says, yes, you can do, sampling. You can do sampling as well, but it's not necessarily based on square footage. You can do it on any square foot size building. And then if you look for R-type occupancies, R or I, the sampling is actually based on the number of units you have. So differences here, similar but different, similar in the fact that you can sample, different in the fact of what triggers your ability to sample or how to sample. The next task there is if testing is if you can have an exception for testing. And the answer is yes. All the pathways allow you to exempt yourself from testing. However, you have to meet the next three items in this group, in this table. So your materials have to meet the ASTM standard. Your assemblies are tested, and you have envelope verification. So you're not doing a blower door test per se on the whole building like you were above, but you're still going to have to do some type of infiltration leakage testing on your envelope assemblies. So you're not quite completely exempt from testing. You still have to do some testing. So you could say your materials are spec'd to meet the ASTM standard. You test some air barrier component assemblies, and then you also do some envelope verification. They might be asking, what is envelope verification? Envelope verification is, by definition in the code, installation inspections and deficiency logs, or logs for corrections. So when you go out and do your envelope site visits, or somebody goes out to do any items found have to go in issue logs along with corrective actions or actions taken to correct that deficiency. One other thing for envelope verification is a design review. So if you opt to not do the whole building testing and do these exceptions, you have to have a building envelope design review as part of your envelope verification. And then the last thing in this table is, what if I'm above this allowable leakage rate of 0.40 or 0.30? Well, you're allowed to go above that, but you have to stay below 0.60. And if you fall within those ranges, then you have to do thermal imaging or tracer smoke to identify issues. You then have to fix those areas that you can fix without destruction of the envelope. So that might be caulking some areas, that might be, there might be patching a roof leak or something like that. As long as you don't have to destruct your envelope, you have to fix those areas. Then you also have to send a separate report with the log of items found during the thermal imaging or tracer smoke, and then any items that were corrected, what measures were taken to be corrected for those. So that is probably by far the biggest categories that I see for similarities and differences in envelope, is this envelope testing or leakage category. So with that, that wraps up the envelope section. So let's talk now on the mechanical section. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So similarities. So I've noticed that my copy and paste of the ASHRAE 90.1 is going to be throughout, so I apologize for that. But similarities in the mechanical systems between ASHRAE 90.1 and IECC are our heating and cooling load calculations. So both ASHRAE 90.1 and IECC says that to calculate your heating and cooling loads, you are to use ASHRAE 189. And so that's the same throughout both pathways. Also, another similarity in the mechanical section are some of your controls. I say some. Some of those are the economizer fault detection diagnostics are the same. Having controls in hotel rooms, having your setbacks for your mechanical systems, your dead band requirements for your mechanical systems, and any optimum start controls. So all of those are similar in either pathway that you go down. Differences between the two are equipment efficiencies. That could fall into both similarities and differences because a lot of them stay the same between the two. They're getting closer and closer together, but I wanted to make sure I called out that there are some differences between the two. And then, again, controls was on the other one, but there also are some differences between the two. So IECC has the most differences in controls, and those are your hot water boiler. So IECC has a outdoor temperature setback based on, or a reset based on your outdoor air temperature for your boiler. Demand control ventilation threshold is different in IECC than ASHRAE. ASHRAE is based on the average occupant load, or sorry, IECC is based on the average occupant load of 15 people or greater per 1,000 square foot of floor area. That's what your demand control ventilation is on. But ASHRAE says that it's 25 people or greater. So the difference is how many people are in that space. 15 people or greater for IECC, or 25 people or greater for ASHRAE for demand control ventilation on when that is needed. IECC also has part load controls for hydronic systems over 300,000 BTU. And IECC also has pump isolation controls for chilled water plants. So these are the differences that IECC and ASHRAE, IECC basically has the majority of the differences here over ASHRAE. So let's talk about some of these efficiencies. There are pages and pages of equipment listings in both IECC and ASHRAE. What I did is I just grabbed 6 here just to give you a sample of what that looks like. Again, try to make it simple and highlight in yellow the only differences. So right now, what I'm showing you on the screen is water-cooled air conditioners between 135,000 and 240,000 BTUs have a different efficiency rating between the 2 pathways. Other than that, in the 6 that I'm showing, the efficiencies are exactly the same no matter which pathway you go down. It was really hard for me to come up and try to do a side-by-side comparison without showing 15 pages of tables here. So just to give you an idea that things are pretty close. Duct insulation values in ASHRAE versus IECC on the screen. Nothing's highlighted, but again, I wanted to show you that the pathways do have similarities, that even though duct insulation values are required on both pathways, they're both same. Both are the same for your mechanical systems. I do want to point out here that duct insulation values in ASHRAE show other options. And what I mean by that is, here's the table. So this is cut out of ASHRAE. And so you can see that supply and return ducts for heating and cooling is a category. Supply and return ducts for heating only. Supply and return ducts for cooling only. So ASHRAE has more options that you would have to follow to show, based on your system's capabilities, if it's heating only, cooling only, or does both. So the table that was on before does both. Most of the systems we deal with do both, so that's why I showed that it's very similar no matter which pathway. So that's it for mechanical similarities and differences. There are more. Those are the biggest ones that I saw in going through the codes. The biggest ones, you want to keep an eye on are your efficiency requirements for your mechanical systems. I don't want to downplay how many pages of efficiencies there are. So let's jump into service water heating. Similarities between ASHRAE 90.1 and IECC 2021, pipe insulation thickness. It's the same thickness on your piping insulation no matter which pathway you go down. Differences, there are a lot more. Heat traps. ASHRAE says that heat traps are needed only if they aren't integral heat traps and the system is non-circulating. IECC says that it has to have integral heat traps. So there are some differences there for service water heating. So this is your domestic water heating on heat traps. Then we go to controls. Storage temperature controls, 100 or 120 degrees or lower. Automatic time switches or other controls to turn off systems during extended periods of time when hot water is not required. Outlet temperature controls, 110 degrees or lower, and circulation pump controls. So these are the controls and differences between the two, IECC and ASHRAE. So just know that IECC does require some different controls based on their storage temperature than ASHRAE does. Flow rates and efficiencies. So for IECC, You also have to have circulation system pumps to auto stop when temp in the loop is at the temp and there's no call, or if you have a heat trace system, adjust the energy input to the heat trace to maintain loop temperature when in occupancy, and also turn off when no demand for hot water. These are a lot confusing. These are all controls. If you want to think about it, you're going to have a control. The easiest way to think about it is you're going to have a control system no matter what on your service water heating, no matter which pathway. The way that those are controlled could be very well different depending on the pathway you go down. But you still need to have some type of control system on there. So from a price standpoint, it's probably no different. You're still buying a control package, but from a functional testing and commissioning, which you have to do, there are some differences in terms of what needs to be checked out. So let's now look at the other thing in the differences category for service water heating. Again, try to make this as simple as possible. On the left side, we have our type of water heaters, our sizes, and then we have ASHRAE 90.1 in one column and IECC 2021 in the other. You can see there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some differences, very minor differences. But again, just trying to highlight, make it easy for you to read. If you know what systems you typically see or use or design to, go ahead and find that in the table and see if there are any differences between ASHRAE and IECC. And that's it for the service water heating side. So let's jump now to the electrical section. Now, I will point out that there are differences in how ASHRAE and IECC call electrical. I group them all into one. ASHRAE breaks them out into lighting versus power. So for the sake of this presentation, that's all grouped into the electrical category. Similarities, occupancy sensors. Occupancy sensors turn off after 20 minutes and turn on to 50% and also have manual control. Same both pathway. Voltage drop. The feeder conductors and branch circuits combined can't have more than a 5% voltage drop. Both pathways are the same. Automatic receptacle control. Both pathways are the same. 50% of the branch circuit feeders need to have the receptacle control, and 25% of the modular furniture not shown on the CDs need to have receptacle control. So before, ASHRAE was the only one that required receptacle control, where 50% is turned off. Sorry, I said that wrong. 50% of the receptacles have to be turned off on that. But both pathways now require that, both ASHRAE and IECC. Transformer efficiencies are exactly the same. Light reduction control are exactly the same. Daylight responsive controls are exactly the same. Exterior lighting control is exactly the same. So a lot of those are exactly the same control systems that you'll have on there. The differences are energy monitoring. I'm trying to find my notes here or talk about. Okay, so in IECC, energy monitoring is required on spaces over 25,000 square feet. And you have to measure, monitor, record, and report that energy, and it's broken down into categories: HVAC, interior lighting, exterior lighting, plug load, process load, and building operations and other miscellaneous loads. So there's 5 categories that IECC requires you to monitor from an energy standpoint. For ASHRAE, the categories are total electrical energy, HVAC, interior lighting, exterior lighting, and receptacle loads. So the categories, still 5 categories, but they're just broken out differently. It's the same requirement in terms of square footage for ASHRAE as it is for IECC, where any buildings over 25,000 square feet are required to monitor their energy. However, the differences are tenant spaces. ASHRAE addresses tenant spaces. So any tenant spaces that obtain more than 10,000 square feet, that's not in a residential unit, then it has to be monitored separately, and that has to go to the tenant as well. They have to be able to see those reports. One more difference between energy monitoring are for dwelling units. For IECC, it's 2,500 square feet or more have to be monitored. And for ASHRAE, not in dwelling units under 10,000 square feet. So a lot of differences there in that energy monitoring category. Differences also include exterior lighting allowances, dwelling unit efficacy, parking garage lighting controls, and time clock controls. So let's look at the allowances for exterior lighting allowances. This is a category that we said those are differences. Again, I want to just make it easy, look at the highlighted yellow to show you the differences. I combined the ASHRAE versus IECC in one cell for ease of use or ease of reading, or else this table got pretty long. But you can see for exterior lighting allowances, IECC appears to be more forgiving in watts per square foot for entry canopies and open areas, but less forgiving in the building facade area. So these are the only 3 categories that had differences. All the other categories for exterior lighting allowances are exactly the same no matter which pathway you go down. So let's look at the lighting power density allowance. Again, I just picked a few categories that we see quite often in the area. And you'll see that using the building area method, the values are exactly the same in these categories for your lighting power density. So it doesn't matter which pathway you go down, you'll be following the same table. So that's it for electrical. Let's now jump into the last category, which is miscellaneous, and then we'll open it up for questions after this section. So if you remember or recall at the beginning of the presentation, there was that plus category, no matter which pathway you went down. We're going to talk about those plus categories. The first one being commissioning. ASHRAE breaks commissioning down into sections, each section. So each section has a different commissioning requirement. So building envelope will have something different than the mechanical section for ASHRAE. IECC lumps it all together into one category. To make it easy on you, I went ahead and created a table. The differences here in these tasks are some are required to be submitted with permit and some aren't, or before you call for final certificate of occupancy inspection. So you can see a design review is required for envelope in ASHRAE pathway, but no design review is required in IECC. Commissioning plan is required in both pathways. However, you need to submit a commissioning plan with the permit set if you're following the ASHRAE pathway. So the commissioning plan is still going to get done. It's just one has to be submitted earlier than the other. System adjusting and balancing needs to happen for ASHRAE 90.1. Inspections need to happen also for ASHRAE 90.1. My table is off here. I'm sorry, there's missing an X there. Inspections need to happen for ASHRAE 90.1, but not IECC 20.1. Functional performance testing needs to happen both pathways. Issues logged both pathways. Preliminary report, final report, both pathways. So differences here are deferred testing plan, training documentation, and your design review. Everything else is pretty much the same, with the exception of maybe having to submit it at a different time. So the other miscellaneous items, if you're following the IECC prescriptive path, if you remember section 406, that was a category where you had 6 or 8 options and you had to pick one to go above and beyond as an additional energy efficiency option. They've now said it's based on credits. So if you wanted to do 10% better on your lighting power density, that's great. But that might not be enough energy efficiency measures to get to the 10 credits. So that might be weighted only 1 credit. So you might need to do another credit. So just know that there is a miscellaneous category for following the prescriptive in IECC that requires you to get to 10 credits in there. And there's a bunch of tables to look at to say, I can pick and choose. I'm going to do this one, and this one, and that's how I'm going to get my 10 credits. The other miscellaneous item is ASHRAE monitoring. ASHRAE calls out that you actually, not just the energy stuff that we were looking at before from the electrical section, you also have to monitor other fuels, these other things. So natural gas, fuel oil, propane, steam, chilled water, and hot water. So that is an additional monitoring item in ASHRAE that you have to do. So with that, we'll open up the poll question again. Erica, if you don't mind launching that.
Yep, just give me 1 sec. Okay.
All right. So now that we've gone through the presentation, it's the same question. Which pathway do you think is going to be the easiest to comply? So again, we asked this before. There's 5 pathways. Going into it, you might have had a perception of which pathway was the easiest, but now after the presentation, you might have a different perception. Maybe your perception's still the same. So it's interesting to see what the group thinks on this. Go ahead and submit your polls or your responses.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And it looks like we're pretty consistent with before, Kevin, which is interesting. I think it also is dependent on what project type you have, right? So, oh, I forgot to share results. There we go. It's also depending on the project type. You know, if you're doing a small addition or alteration, prescriptive might be the way to go. A larger commercial project might look at that total building performance or Appendix G.
Right.
It really is. Okay, and I'll go ahead and do the other poll and see if any changes happen there.
Yeah, so the second question is going to be the same as the beginning of the presentation. So now that you've heard the similarities and differences between ASHRAE and IECC, or 2021 and 2019, which pathway do you think will use the least amount of energy?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll. There we go.
Okay. Very similar results. We had a few more people jump on board on the energy cost budget, a few less people off of total building performance, but I think it's pretty similar. Okay, great. So that I thank you for attending. That's the end of the comparison. There's a lot of comparisons left to do. However, with the amount of time and leaving time for questions and answers, that is what we were able to cover today. Hopefully you get a better idea and are more informed on which pathway you would like to pursue on maybe on your next project. So I'll open it up for questions and throw it back to you, Erica.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So we've got a question here on which pathway do you think is the easiest and that you think saves the most energy. Just to kick it off, I mean, I've done my fair share of energy modeling, and most often than not, Appendix G seems to be the easiest to model. But that's not to say that IECC is any less efficient. It sounds like from a lot of the articles that I've been reading in the investigating of the IECC 2021, it's becoming more in line with, as you saw, with ASHRAE. So the energy savings between the two codes are definitely, the gap is being closed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say in Colorado, where we have incentives for modeling, energy design assist or some type of design assist modeling, rebates or incentives, we've seen a lot of people go that pathway, not necessarily because it's the easiest, but because the cost to do that modeling versus the savings, overall building savings, and knowing how the building is going to save energy was really a benefit and why people did that, a modeling pathway. And I would agree with you, Erica, in terms of which pathway saves the most energy. Before, I might have said something different. However, they are getting closer and closer to each other, that there's no more big differences that I can see that one uses more energy or has less efficient equipment in it than the other. It's very small differences now. So I would agree with you.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And then we do have a couple of raised hands here. I'm going to go ahead and allow Tim Swanson to talk. So if you go ahead and unmute yourself, Tim, you can ask Kevin and I directly.
I did not mean to raise my hand. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Going to the next raised hand, we have Rob Clark. If you'd like to unmute yourself. That might have also been an accident. And I'm going to also allow Patrick Hunter to talk if you would like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my question, I'm a layman, although I've been a contractor, but I haven't been involved in these codes. I've been wondering if the ultimate goal here is to reduce the amount of energy used in buildings. if it doesn't make, and then maybe this is under the performance category, but is there a way to use the actual energy use, utility bills, as a cutoff point, if you will?
So let me rephrase your question to see if I understand it. So you're wondering if the amount of energy actually used in the building via utility bills is a alternative way to show how much the energy, show that we've reduced the amount of energy as much as possible. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, and then leave it open to the developer designers to hit that target.
Sure. So I think that the difficult part with that is the building has to be built already. And so for existing buildings, I think that's great to leave it up to the building developer or whoever to make sure that those bills go down. For new builds, what I see the code is trying to do is to try to ensure those bills are as low as possible before the building is built. So I think we're looking at two different ways, but I think it's a great and a fantastic way to look at it from an existing building standpoint.
All right. Thanks, Patrick and Kevin. Just moving on to the next question here. We've got one. Is the use of listed products no longer an alternative for envelope testing? What barriers are you seeing to commercial envelope testing?
The listed products no longer an alternative. Right. So I think what you're getting at is before there was 3 pathways for envelope testing. Your materials could, as long as your materials are stamped with that ASTM standard, was one. Your assemblies testing was the second, and then whole building testing was the third. So I think that's what you're getting at is not just listing the materials meeting that ASTM standard acceptable. And that is acceptable. Let me see if I can go back to that slide. Give me a second. Okay, so you can see here, under testing exceptions, materials meet that ASTM standard. So that does get you out of testing your whole building. However, you still have to do some sort of testing. You now have to do assemblies testing and a design review for your envelope. So listing your products as having that ASTM standard does get you out of the whole building test, but you also have to do some type of testing of your assemblies on that. Hopefully that answers that part of the question. And then the second part is I think you asked, what are some of the barriers I'm seeing on commercial envelope testing? Right now, what I'm seeing is just the lack of experience or knowledge of testing and what that is. A lot of people think that just because the drawings show a complete air barrier means that they were installed that way. And so just kind of a lack of experience in knowing how buildings are built in your jurisdiction on if they are tight or not is kind of the biggest barrier. What I see when I go out is that there are blatant spots that are different than the drawings in terms of how the envelope connects. So the biggest barrier there is where 2 different air barrier materials meet. And that's usually done by 2 different subcontractors. So we might have a subcontractor installing the roof membrane, which is an air barrier, and that connects to your vertical wall air barrier, which is a different subcontractor installing that. And timing of that is what I see, and the connection of those points is what I see as one of the biggest barriers in the testing when it comes to testing, is that those don't get adhered together or connected together.
Thanks, Kevin. Another question for you. Do you predict a time when ASHRAE 90.1 and IECC consolidate? Seems confusing that they are separate, both with multiple pathways. And I'll just start this off with, I don't think that there's, Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong here, if you've heard different, but I don't think there's a plan to consolidate them. The ASHRAE 9.1 is a standard and IECC is a code. So what that means is that the code tells you what to do and then the standard tells you how to do it. So that's why you see a lot of IECC in Denver, I know too, they reference ASHRAE for how to do certain things. So I think it's good that they're aligning in terms of energy efficiency, but ASHRAE might be continued to use as more explanatory than an actual code.
Very good.
Okay, next question. Are there any exemptions to the thermal envelope in the ASHRAE code for small equipment buildings?
That's a good question. Let me see if I can go back and look at my notes, see if there is. I know there are. So usually, we can get back to this, but I will say usually for small buildings or small equipment buildings, things like that, you don't have to meet the thermal envelope testing. Now, in terms of the envelope being installed, there usually aren't too many exceptions for that. So I guess I don't know exactly if you're talking about, R values of walls and air barriers, or if you're actually talking about performance of those systems. But in terms of the R value and air barrier, usually those are not exempt in small buildings. However, testing could be exempt. I would have to get back to you on if ASHRAE actually calls out exactly, the size of equipment buildings or anything like that.
Yeah, and feel free to follow up with us on any questions. I think, Kevin, you posted your email there. It's kperry@noresco.com. Or mine is edelello@noresco. Feel free to just follow up if there are any additional questions. Kevin and I will stay on for another minute here. But otherwise, thank you all for attending today. Just another friendly reminder that we will be skipping next week. And then the last webinar series will be happening on the 12th. So I hope to see you then.
Erica, I see a couple more hands up. I don't know if they went up on purpose or not.
Yeah, so we've got, I unmuted them and Patrick asked his question, and Rob, if you still have a question, you have the ability to unmute if you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.